This video is sponsored by the Magnet Baron. More about them later on. What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and at this point, we are deep into Chapter Approved 2025, the new mission format for Warhammer 40k, and I wanted to go through and discuss some of the objectives. Today, we're going to be talking about secondary objectives, and I'm going to put them into a tier list, both for tactical objective play as well as fixed objective play, using the tournament companion. Now, I want to start by talking about fixed secondaries. Obviously, these are secondaries you can choose at the beginning of the game to lock into your hand rather than drawing from the tactical deck. You cut yourself off from a lot of important tools that the tactical deck has, the biggest one being CP generation by discarding cards at the end of your turn, and your opponent now knows how you're going to score, so the counterplay to these is more readily available. However, I do think that fixed secondaries in Chapter Approved 2025 are a little bit more powerful than they were in Pariah Nexus. The existence of challenger cards allowing you to recoup losses on victory points if you do end up getting screwed out of a secondary score at some point by your opponent counterplaying you is a huge deal for fixed secondaries. I also think that there's going to be some skew lists potentially that fixed secondaries are explicitly designed to punish, looking at things like multi-super heavy Imperial Knights, that I think that fixed secondaries are going to maybe come back into vogue in a small way, so it's important to talk about them. Now, up here in S tier, I want to put several right off the bat. These are secondaries that when they're available for you, and if your opponent is playing a list that you can score these off of and plays in such a way that you'll be able to score them reliably, these are going to do really well. These are Assassination, Cull the Horde, and Bring It Down. These are all secondaries that score off destroying particular types of enemy units, meaning that you can look at your opponent's list composition and decide before the game begins how easy it will be for you to kill them. Usually what you're looking for is an army that focuses primarily on these styles of units, is going to be focusing on these units to take objectives, meaning that they will be required to play them aggressively and move them into threat range. And you are also playing a list that is capable of killing them without giving up too much. If you have a list that's focusing on doing maneuver secondaries and scoring action points on doing actions and things like that, maybe don't take these secondaries particularly, because a lot of your army is going to be devoted to performing those actions and stuff like that. So focusing very heavily on killing your opponent might not be the right call. Similarly, if your opponent has a ton of individual small units and can barely give up, assassination or bring it down, if you max the score out, however, they're not incentivized to reveal those models to your army until the end of the game, you're probably less excited about these. So I would say that in the situations where these secondaries are good, they are very good and they are transformative to the game, and you should probably take them if all the stars align. However, it's important to recognize that that's not every single situation that you could possibly run into. Now, our next one is behind enemy lines. I'm actually going to place this one in A tier up here. Now, there's some pluses and minuses, some strengths and weaknesses to behind enemy lines. It allows you to score consistent points at a very strong baseline. It allows you to score a reasonable number of victory points with only a single unit. The only requirement is that they get wholly within your opponent's deployment zone. Easy peasy. If you are playing an army that is focused on maneuvering very quickly, has close range deep strikes, double movements, very fast moving units, this secondary is very good, because as long as you're able to get into that spot, you can score pretty high points without having to do anything, without having to perform actions. You can still attack your opponent, you can disrupt their objective scoring, and sometimes you can even sort of commit into their back line, clear their back objective, and then score this passively for the rest of the game, and that's a huge deal. So if you are built for it, this secondary can be very good. The downside is that if you don't have that level of maneuverability, this secondary is a detriment, because all your opponent has to do is screen out their back line, clear out your fast utility, and suddenly you're going to be down the creek, as it were. So that's something I would consider. This is extremely good for armies that are very, very fast, much less good for armies that are not specifically built to play it. On the flip side, I will say too that there is a downside to behind enemy lines, which is that oftentimes units that are scoring behind enemy lines are not super useful otherwise in the game. A unit that is in your opponent's deployment zone is not on most of the primary objectives. Most of the objectives are going to be contained within no man's land, which does not score the secondary. So there is a little bit of a release of pressure from your opponent's primary by your units going to score this. Now, that is not necessarily the case for our next one, which is going to be Cleanse. Now, I'm going to put this down in B tier. The nice thing about Cleanse is that it has a very good scoring floor. At a baseline, all you have to do is get a unit to your expansion objective, the one closest to your deployment zone, and perform the Cleanse action on that objective every turn, and that will score you 10 points. The downside is that scoring any higher than that is more difficult. It requires that you take a second objective, and then you perform another action on that objective every single round. So now you've taken 2 units out of your army. Those units are only going to be spending their turns performing objectives, and you have to be able to consistently take a second objective outside your deployment zone, which against an aggressive opponent can be very difficult. So I would put this one down in B tier here because I think the requirement that you perform 2 actions with 2 separate units on 2 separate objectives, both of whom you control, is very difficult. So while the floor is low, the ceiling is also going to be relatively low for Cleanse as well. Now, the same is kind of the case for Engage on all fronts, which I'm also going to put down in B tier here. This is very similar to Cleanse in that it has a very, very high floor of scoring. Engage on all fronts will score you at least 1 victory point basically every round of 40k that you play with it, and it's almost impossible not to score its first 1 VP mission parameter. That's so simple, it's stupid. The other benefit that Engage on all fronts has in comparison to Behind Enemy Lines is that it does allow you to score it while you are competing for objectives, whereas Behind Enemy Lines will oftentimes require that your units scoring it are moving either to the opponent's home objective, but if that's not the case, then somewhere random inside their deployment zone. Engage on all fronts allows you to fight over the center objectives in no man's land while still scoring it passively, which is awesome. And it's very much like Cleanse, going to be scoring you between 1 and 2 victory points a turn at a baseline. And if you are taking these, they are very consistent. You can maybe make up the difference in challenger cards if your opponent is outscoring you with their tactical secondaries, but at least you're going to be scoring a pretty solid number of points regardless. The problem is that like a decent number of points, but not a crazy number, doesn't usually win the game, and that's really what we're trying to do here. The other downside that Engage on all fronts has is that it requires 4 separate units to be in particular positions in order to score its highest level, which is not the most difficult thing in the world because this doesn't require that you perform any actions or anything, but it does mean that you are throwing your army into the teeth of the enemy, and you're going to be losing those units fairly consistently. So being able to complete this over the course of the game without losing too much of your army might be a little difficult. Now, I'm going to take this next one, Establish Locus, and I'm basically going to be treating this one as an improved version of Cleanse, or at least a different version of Cleanse. We're going to put Establish Locus up here in A tier because at the base level, it has essentially the same floor of scoring as Cleanse does. Establish Locus is largely going to score you 2 victory points around if you're able to put a utility unit somewhere near the center of the battlefield. This one is also very good if you can identify terrain features that allow you to perform the Establish Locus action from out of line of sight. That allows you to score this secondary very, very consistently, so this also might depend on a little bit on terrain. The flip side is that in order to score the maximum from Establish Locus, you only need to perform 1 action, whereas Cleanse requires that you perform 2. And that is big. The other thing is that this requires you to touch the opponent's deployment zone, not be wholly within it. That's a big one. It doesn't require that you take an objective, and it's still, because it's not quite as constraining of a positional requirement as Behind Enemy Lines, it allows you to still sort of be relevant to the game while you're performing the Establish Locus action. If you're able to sort of blast a hole in your opponent's backline and get a unit back there to Establish Locus every turn, this is phenomenal. And if your opponent's not able to sort of reorient to attack you, because it's going to be scoring you the same amount as Cleanse with significantly less downsides, and that is a big deal. Very similar to Behind Enemy Lines, though, you have to be an army that is built to score this. You have to have an army that has a absolute glut of utility units, of fast units, of close-range deep strikers, of units that can get into your opponent's deployment zone in the late game so that you can max out the score for this secondary, because otherwise, if we aren't getting close to that 20-point score, the fixed secondaries are not necessarily worth taking. Now, unfortunately, we do have a whole tier by itself for Storm Hostile Objective. This secondary is not very good. It seems like it would be good, and I see a lot of players make the mistake of like windmill slamming this one into a fixed secondary composition because they're like, oh, all I have to do is take my opponent's objectives, which means I just have to play the primary game. It's like, you know, Bring It Down or Call the Horde into an army that is able to score those against, where all I need to do is play the game normally and kill my opponent's units, and I'll score points passively. Except as soon as your opponent sees that you have Storm Hostile Objective, they're immediately going to start playing around it. They are not going to take objectives if they don't need to. Instead of taking your objectives and allowing you to then retake them to score Storm Hostile objective, they are going to contest them by equalizing the OC value of the units on those objectives so that you don't score it, but you also don't score Storm Hostile. It becomes an absolute nightmare. And while there are certainly going to be turns where you score it, I would say on average, it's likely you score it maybe 3-ish times per game on a good day, and then your opponent's able to counterplay it for the remainder of that time. And unfortunately, that's not good enough for a secondary objective. So a player who knows what they're doing is going to be running circles around somebody who's running Storm Hostile objective as their fixed secondary. So we're going to leave that one at the bottom of the tier list here. This video is brought to you by the Magnet Baron. Magnet Baron is your one-stop shop for all of your miniature magnetization needs. If you are looking to get into some of the new big stompy factions that have just released, Magnet Baron wants me to talk to you about their new no-drill magnet kits. These are kits that apply alongside large miniatures like Imperial Knights and give you replacement parts as well as magnets that allow you to utilize the entire kit, adding specialized attachments and joints that allow you to add magnets into the construction of the model, allowing you to easily swap your weapons on and off. With how fast the metagame of 10th edition Warhammer 40k changes, having flexible weapon options on your models just makes sense, and especially for these expensive vehicle and Titan kits that have a wide variety of options available to them, magnets are the way to go. So check them out at themagnetbaron.com. Links are in the video description. Big thanks to Magnet Baron for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to it. Now we're moving on to tactical secondaries. And while you can't select these secondaries at the start of the game, it's obviously important to identify the usefulness of these secondaries and their ease of scoring, which is going to be kind of how I am approaching this particular tier list. Secondaries at the top of the end, I am much less likely to discard, either through new orders or at the end of my turn. And the secondaries at the lower end are ones that either have really, really tough scoring criteria that oftentimes don't score, force you to kind of go out of your way in order to score them, or I will typically discard. Now, we're going to start this with Assassination, and I'm going to put this one somewhere here around C tier. Now, Assassination feels like it should be a good one. It's just a kill secondary. It doesn't require you to do anything particularly strenuous, and while I will admit that oftentimes the game state is very conducive to Assassination, like, for example, you've just been in a fight phase in your opponent's turn, you've stripped most of a bodyguard unit, and there's just a character sort of standing out in the middle of nowhere, and you draw Assassination, and you're like, well, that was easy. I was going to kill that guy anyway. That can often happen. The problem is that you have no control over when that happens, and Assassination is probably the most difficult secondary of any of the kill secondaries to score if you draw it outside of one of those particular instances. So if you and your opponent's army aren't actually engaged in like a big, huge fight in the middle of the table where all your characters are battling, Assassination is very difficult for you to proactively go and do. Most of your opponent's characters are going to be embedded in bodyguard units. They're going to be hiding behind line of sight blockers. They're going to be in their like utility characters that are in their deployment zone or lone operatives that you can't get into range of. So if you draw this really early or in a position where you're not set up to kill their characters, this is just a dead secondary. So outside of the situations where the stars have aligned and you are ready to score it right off the bat, it's very difficult to actually be able to go proactively do. Now, we do have another one of these secondaries here with Cull the Horde, and I'm actually going to place this one below Assassination. That sounds a little bit weird because I just kind of like talked crap about Assassination being difficult to score by itself. But here's the thing. First of all, Cull the Horde is very rarely scored. It's not that often that your opponent has units with a starting strength of 13 or higher. That means 13 models in a unit, which is basically reserved for like guardsman units that have attached command squads and like orcs, sometimes, maybe Tyranids if they're taking a Termagant blob or something. The downside of this one is that if you score it in a position where you can score it, it's kind of like an awkward one. The downside of this is that oftentimes your opponent will only have 1 or 2 units that are eligible for Cull the Horde. If you don't draw it in a position where they are presenting themselves to the battle, very similar to Assassination, it's not going to be scoreable. The units that Cull the Horde scores off of are oftentimes as well some of the units that your opponent is trying their hardest to keep alive. So if you're considering something like a Termagant unit or a Guardsman squad, oftentimes what those units are trying to do is stack defensive buffs on themselves in order to regenerate models in a future turn to come back into play in order to take objectives. So your opponent is already placing these units in a position where they're difficult for you to interact with. And obviously, just like Assassination, if you draw it in a position where they're not allowing you to attack those units, you can't score it at all, and it will just kind of like awkwardly sit in your hand. The one benefit that Cull the Horde has is that it will redraw itself much more readily if your opponent doesn't have any of these units. Assassination is basically no situation unless you're actually killing your opponent where they have no characters on the battlefield, so that can be a little bit tough. Call the Horde, oftentimes your opponent has none of those units on the battlefield, so it will just redraw. So this doesn't usually matter, but because it targets selectively units that your opponent is like basically trying to keep alive at all costs, it's very difficult to actually score out. Next up, we have Recover Assets. I'm going to put this one up in B tier. With the new Recover Assets in Chapter Approved 2025, this one's nice because it's a one-turn action. The downside is that it requires at least 2 units to perform the action, which is kind of a heavy cost to your army if you're not prepared for it. While there is a significant upside if you can have 3 units perform the Recover Assets action, that's usually kind of a win more. If I have units in my opponent's deployment zone and in all other areas of the table who are able to perform an action, then I think I'm winning anyway. I don't think that 6 victory point clause matters so much. Now, the next one is going to be behind enemy lines, and this one is probably most dependent on your army composition, kind of like what we talked about with fixed secondaries. If you don't play a very fast army that has easy access to your opponent's deployment zone, behind enemy lines is kind of an annoying one to score. And if you are playing fixed secondaries, between this secondary, engaged all fronts, and established locus, your opponent is probably incentivized to screen out their deployment zone from deep strikers. So even if you have reserve utility units who are going to be jumping in to try to score those secondaries, your opponent is probably trying to screen you out. Because you're not usually building to score this one in particular, like you would be if you were planning to play it with fixed, you have fewer units who are have fast enough on the table to be able to move into the deployment zone to score it. So this one's very situational, and it does redraw itself on the first battle round, which I do appreciate. But if you draw it second battle round, top of round 2, for example, it's basically just a dead draw, and it's usually just dead in your hand, unless you have a close deep striker or your opponent doesn't have appropriate screens, which is a very particular situation. I'm actually going to put this one down in D tier because very often I find that this one just immediately turns into a command point or it gets new orders right off the bat, unless you are drawing it really late game. Next one's Area Denial. I went back and forth on this one because this one's actually really easy to deny from your opponent. There's a lot of situations in which you can stop your opponent from scoring this at all, and there's some board states in which it's just a dead draw. If your opponent has big, huge tanks in the center of the table that you're not prepared to kill, then Area Denial is just super dead. Or the flip side is that the upside of Area Denial is huge. If your opponent has nothing in the middle of the table, you can move out, potentially score some other secondaries at the same time, like establish locus, extend battle lines, or secure no man's land, and then also potentially deny your opponent's Area Denial if they draw it on the subsequent turn. So for that reason, it's got really significant highs and significant lows. I'm gonna put it in B tier here simply because more often than not you're happy about drawing it, but it does sort of require that you play a little aggressively, and there are some situations in which your opponent is just passively preventing it. Now, I'm gonna put right next to that our next one, Display of Might. This one has been it's really interesting. This is a brand new secondary for Chapter Approved 2025. It requires that you have more units in the no man's land than your opponent does. Now, fortunately for you, it scores at the end of your turn, which means that you have the opportunity to both move your units into that position and also kill opponent's units. So you have 2 ways to stop this from scoring. And while there is counterplay to it, which is your opponent pushing stuff into the no man's land, unlike something like behind enemy lines where your opponent's just screening out their backline, that's much more difficult and much more dangerous to do. If you're forcing your entire army into the no man's land to deny Display of Might, unless the terrain you have is perfect and super heavy, then you are probably just running them into attack range and you have to give up stuff to your opponent anyway. The downside is that if you're playing a very aggressive opponent, oftentimes they'll just be passively preventing you from scoring this. If you are pinned in your deployment zone, if you're jailed, for example, and your opponent has pushed really hard and they've just had their go turn, they can stop you from scoring this relatively easily. But it's essentially the same as Area Denial. So I'm actually going to place this one right up here around Area Denial. It's very simple if you draw it in the early game before your opponent's played very aggressively, where they have 2 to 3 units in no man's land, and you just simply shuffle 1 extra unit in no man's land, maybe kill one of their utility units, and then call it a day, score your Display of Might. That's pretty nice. If you get it where your opponent has a ton on the battlefield and they have just pushed into you and you draw it, very much like Area Denial, where if your opponent has swung towards the middle and then you draw Area Denial, it feels really bad. Display of Might's essentially the same way. Now, one weird thing about Display of Might that I really don't like, but just because it's kind of a gear check compared to the other maneuver secondaries, is that for some reason it checks battle-shocked units, whereas other secondaries like Area Denial, for example, can be contested by battle-shocked units, which is fine. They can't be scored by battle-shocked units, and Display of Might can, and I don't know why that is. So if you compare it to behind enemy lines or engage in all fronts, Display of Might allows you to score it with units that have been battle-shocked, and it's weird because it's such an exception to the other maneuver secondaries. It's not that big of a deal unless you are playing against an army that's massively battle shock oriented, like Tyranids, for example, who can battle shock your whole army potentially in one go, which can shut off things like engage or behind enemy lines. Display of Might doesn't have that weakness. I mean, it's like good for it, but it's weird that it doesn't work that way. Now, next up, we are moving to Bring It Down. And I think this is one of the easier of the kill-focused secondaries. I'm actually just going to put this one in B tier around here. It is very heavily dependent on the board state, whether your opponent has given you a vehicle to attack. But usually, in today's day and age, there will be one or two vehicles that you both must interact with and are in a position to be interacted with. If your opponent's playing dedicated transports, they usually have dedicated transports doing things in the center of the battlefield. If they're playing something like knights or super heavy spam, then they're going to be up in your face anyway. The one downside I find of this one is that it doesn't have a high upside for scoring. If it requires that you kill something big, it's only ever going to score you 4 points. I do sort of wish that if the thing that you killed was like Titanic or Towering, it would give you a small bonus. There was an upside for doing that, so you could push to get more points off of it. I do appreciate that it's not quite as abusive as the Bring It Down version was in the previous, in Pariah Nexus, where you could actually score essentially infinite points if you had a big go turn where you killed multiple vehicles. But it is a little bit weird if your opponent presents you like one Knight Castellan, and that's the thing you have to kill in order to get 4 points, which feels kind of bad. But I do like the floor where killing, a single Warwalker or something will get you 4 points if you draw it on the right time, which is nice. So I think right now, monsters or vehicles are pretty popular. Most armies have them, and most armies have them in aggressive positions where they're going to be in position to be attacked. So this is relatively consistent. It just requires that you change your play pattern oftentimes. Now with that, we're going to move down to Defend Stronghold. I'm also playing Defend Stronghold over here in B tier as well. I'm going to put it towards the bottom of B tier because there are a lot of situations where your opponent can interact with this secondary because it is a full round secondary. If they can shoot you off your home objective or contest your home objective, which can often happen towards the late game, especially against a maneuverable opponent, this is just a dead draw and it feels really bad. But most of the time, it's just 3 points that you just kind of have to think about your screening in order to score, which is good passively, with the downside that it is kind of a disaster if your opponent's able to prevent it. Going from there, we have Cleanse. I'm going to put Cleanse towards the top of B tier here. We talked about this one in the fixed secondary segment, and it's kind of the same thing for the tactical secondary version of Cleanse. You have a very high baseline of scoring. You basically have to do one action with one unit in a really easy position on your expansion objective. You get a couple of points, which is nice, and then if you are in a position where you can get more points, you can potentially score it up to 4. You can potentially score it up to 5. I do like that it scores higher now than it did in Pariah Nexus if you do the full variety of Cleanse, because asking for armies to do the second Cleanse to score the maximum VP from this mission was a little bit tough because it typically required that you threw units away onto the center objective, and you oftentimes saw people just not score the full version of Cleanse if they didn't have other secondaries where they would be incentivized to move to the middle of the table, like Area Denial, for example, in their hand, and so they would just score the 2 victory points on their expansion objective and then call it a day. And I like that this one gives you more incentive to score the 2-action version. I think that 2-action secondaries, very much like Recover Assets, which now completes in a single turn, should be more incentivized by the deck because performing actions with 2 separate units in particular parts of the battlefield can be very disruptive to your game. And so giving you more benefit for those, I think, is just good. Now, Engage at All Fronts is the next one. I'm going to put this one somewhere around B tier. This one is kind of passive, and that can be both a blessing and a curse. It basically scores you 1 victory point all the time, and there's almost literally no way that you don't score that one unless you're essentially tabled. You just have to have 2 units in 2 separate table quarters outside 6 of the center of the table, and then you get a victory point, which is really easy. The downside is that in Chapter Approved 2025, if you draw a card that is able to be scored for victory points, it cannot then be discarded for command points. So Engage at All Fronts is almost always a victory point, even if you don't want to. So sometimes if you, for example, draw this and Cleanse, and you score Cleanse for 5, this gives you a 6th point automatically. You cannot discard it for command points, and sometimes that can give your opponent Challenger if you are leading the game by enough at that stage. So that's like kind of weird. There's some weird downside to Engage at All Fronts. Gets you probably between 1 and 2 points really easily without you really having to change your game plan whatsoever. You can oftentimes score this, but with having units that are contesting your opponent's objectives, and they just get this naturally. Now, moving on, we then have Establish Locus. I think I'm basically going to put this one in the same category as Cleanse, although I think I'm definitely going to put it slightly lower than Cleanse because for the base points score, it does require that you move to the middle of the battlefield, unlike Cleanse, which allows you to, if you want to get your 2 victory point score, just do it on your home home objective, or your expansion objective, I should say, where you're relatively protected. Established Locus requires that you move into the center and expose yourself in most instances to get the 2 points. However, it has a much higher upside where you can score the maximum points from it by simply performing the action with a single unit if you could get your opponent to your opponent's deployment zone. That also, importantly, only requires that you touch the deployment zone, not be wholly within it, like behind enemy lines requires that you do, which is oftentimes very easy for fast units, and it's much more difficult to screen out than behind enemy lines is. So oftentimes you'll see this one scored out for the maximum in the mid to late game relatively simply. So while I don't think the baseline is quite as strong as Cleanse, I think the upside is much higher because it's much easier to score. Now we're going to move into some of the really powerful ones. Extend battle lines is phenomenal. We're going to put that right up in S tier here. Just requires that you hold an objective in the middle and hold your home objective. In most instances, in 40k, you're going to be doing that. That's basically just the passive existence of most armies in 40k, and it gets you 4 points. Easy. You don't have to think about it. You just score it. There is even an easier version if you are literally being tabled, which most armies can also probably do in most instances. This is the easiest secondary to score. It's super straightforward, and you just windmill slam it. Next up is Marked for Death. This is kind of a really interesting one. It's much better than it was previously. Previously, you could only score the targets that your opponent chose in order to score Marked for Death. Now you have the opportunity to get some yourself, which is nice, but the downside being that it only scores you 2 points if you kill something, which is basically just a strictly worse version of No Prisoners. So we're going to put this one down somewhere around Assassination. It has a relatively high floor where the baseline, you're just going to choose the unit that your opponent like ran into the middle of the table to score secondary. You're going to kill that. You're going to get 2 points. That's nice. There is an upside where you get a bunch of points, but the upside is so rare that oftentimes this is just a bad No Prisoners, and that's not that exciting. Now, speaking of which, let's talk about No Prisoners, and let's talk about this one. We're going to put that one up in A tier. The one downside of No Prisoners is when you draw it on like the top of the first turn, or like early game if you're playing a very cagey game where armies aren't really fighting each other, where you can't really score it very well. However, if you are not in that position, in basically any other position, this is going to score you at least 2 points, probably 4 points, and in some cases you get the maximum points from it. And that's it. It basically just requires that you play 40k. You just kill the things in front of you, kill the things that you're contesting your objectives, kill your opponent's easy units to kill, and you'll get points for it. There are some downsides, unlike Extend Battle Lines, where Extend Battle Lines just allows you, requires you move a little bit and then you score it immediately, where No Prisoners will score literally nothing. It doesn't have a redraw clause in the early game. So if you grab it like turn 1 where your opponent has nothing exposed, it's going to be bad for you. But turn 2 onwards, this secondary is basically always live and will almost always score you some pretty serious points. Now, we've talked about basically all the varieties of No Prisoners right off the bat here. The next one's going to be Overwhelming Force, which is essentially No Prisoners, but you have to kill them on the objectives. I'm going to put this one, I think, down here in B tier somewhere. The downside here is that most players are actively playing against or trying to counterplay this secondary. If you are not contesting objectives, there is no incentive for you to go on to that objective if you don't think that your unit's going to be able to score the objective on the subsequent turn, unless you need it to do something like perform an action, or you're trying to enable a special ability or something, which means that Overwhelming Force is usually just naturally played against. People will just be like, hey, I'm going to be an inch off this objective or whatever while I move to shoot you, because then you can't score Overwhelming Force, you can't score Storm Hostile objective, you don't get any of your targeted enemy on an objective abilities, so I'm just going to counterplay this one naturally. That said, once you get to Battle Round 3 onwards, there's almost always units that are available for Overwhelming Force, which makes it a pretty solid objective if you draw it at those points. However, if you draw it really early game, it's basically worthless. And if you draw it really late game, where your opponent has fewer units and oftentimes their units are harder to kill because you've killed all the easy stuff already, that can also be difficult. So it's essentially No Prisoners with extra steps and with a lot of extra riders on it, with the benefit that if you kill a single unit, you get 3 points, which is oftentimes nice. Now, the next one is going to be Sabotage. And while I do think Sabotage is a relatively consistent draw, unfortunately, it gives your opponent a lot of control over when you're able to score it. I'm actually going to put this one at sort of the bottom of C tier here. It does require that your unit performs an action. It is a full round action, and unfortunately, the action that it's required to perform usually makes it easier for your opponent to interact with, because it requires that they be within a terrain feature, which means that if that's a ruin, a line of sight blocking terrain feature, your opponent is most likely able to draw line of sight to them unless the terrain feature blocks true line of sight, so you're behind a solid wall or something. In positions where you can enable that, so if you draw it turn 1 and all you have to do is shuffle outside your deployment zone and be behind a wall, you're probably okay. But if you draw it later on in the game, where you don't have a unit that you necessarily want to perform a full round action on, which is also very detrimental in Chapter Approved 2025, because full round actions prevent you from doing things like heroically intervening or overwatching, Sabotage can be awkward. if you're not in the perfect position for it, it's really weird, and it does sort of remove your unit from the game for an entire round, which is a high downside. That said, it's kind of similar to Defend Stronghold, where your opponent has ways to interact with it. The downside is that it turns your unit off, so it is, I think, worse than Defend Stronghold significantly, and you can't do it in as safe a position. So I consider them to be very similar. I'm usually not that excited about drawing Sabotage, but on the flip side, it also usually scores me 3 points, so I don't know. It's a lot of hoops to jump through to score only 3 points, but I guess that's okay for just sort of like passive income. Next up is Secure No Man's Land. This is going to be another one where we windmill slam it up to S tier. This one's really easy. All you have to do is take objectives in the middle of the battlefield. Easy peasy. We're doing that most of the time already, so the baseline score is essentially always going to be online, and oftentimes we are incentivized, especially early, to be contesting or controlling the objectives that our opponents are taking, which means that we're going to be scoring the maximum points from this. This also grants you more points than other similar objectives like extend battle lines, despite the fact that it requires that you move into more line of sight and you be a little bit more aggressive. Secure No Man's Land does give you an extra incentive for that. This objective is a windmill slam. You're excited about it every time because, like, at a baseline, it's 2 victory points for doing literally nothing. Next is Storm Hostile Objective, and unlike fixed secondaries, while people typically play around this one, I'm actually going to put it down here in A tier, because if your opponent doesn't know when it's going to be drawn, their capacity to counterplay it's much more difficult. Now, while similar to Overwhelming Force, they're oftentimes going to be trying to play around it. Unfortunately, that's not always possible, because sometimes they will just draw extend battle lines or secure no man's land, a secondary that requires that they take an objective rather than contest it, which then opens that objective up to being stormed, and they don't know when that's happening. So that's not the case for fixed secondaries, where your opponent always knows that it's in your hand, so they always get to do that mental arithmetic of whether or not taking the objective is worth it. In this case, it can randomly come up and it can randomly give you points. And in the situations where your opponent has an objective that's easily stormable, you get it for free, essentially, which happens very often. The only downside is when you draw it like very, very early in the game. It does redraw first battle round, which is nice, but if you draw it like battle round 2, where you're not really in a position to take your opponent's objectives, it doesn't score anything. So it's not quite as strong as these, the secondaries up here. But once you're in like battle round 3 onwards, this usually just scores you points, because you're usually just fighting over the center objective or one of the expansion objectives, and that's giving you points pretty easily. Now, next up is going to be Tempting Targets. I'm going to put this one down here in D tier. I think this might be the toughest secondary in the game. This feels like the new Marked for Death. Your opponent chooses an objective on the battlefield, you have to take that objective, and that's oftentimes difficult because they're just going to choose their expansion objective that you're oftentimes not near. You have to be in a very specific situation in order to be able to interact with that objective. So occasionally this will be an easy draw, but most of the time it's going to be an objective that's being controlled by an overwhelming number of objective control from your opponent, or an objective where pushing forward aggressively to take it actually punishes you really hard. So you don't really want to be forced to move out and take it. So there's a big downside to Tempting Target, which is that your opponent has a lot of control over it. I actually do think that because it has an upside in the late game, if you are sort of fighting over all the objectives and you could just like kind of like put more power onto one or the other, it can score you more points than something like Behind Enemy Lines, which has kind of a low baseline. But I do think that Tempting Target is, in my experience at least, it's one of the most redrawn secondaries in the format so far. So with that, that's my tier list for Chapter Approved 2025. I'm interested to hear what other people have to say about this format. If you liked this video, let me know down in the comment section, and I will probably do some more talking about this mission format. Big thanks to Magnet Baron for sponsoring the video, and thanks to you for watching all the way to the end. Thanks to everyone else who supports Tactical Tortoise, whether that's over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.